Victor Blackwell didn't knock. He never did. He pushed open the door of the Blackthorn Valley General Store on a Tuesday morning in October 1885. And he did it the way a man pushes open a door when he already owns everything behind it. Slow, deliberate, with his two hired men stepping in behind him like shadows with boots. The ranchers inside went quiet. Blackwell walked to the counter, set down a single folded document, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Caleb Whitmore's behind on his water rights assessment. 30 days to pay or vacate." He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. Same goes for the Hendersons and the Pruitt family. I'm doing you all a courtesy letting you hear it together. Old Silas Pruitt, 63 years old and missing 2 fingers from a threshing accident, said, "You can't just—" "I already did," Blackwell said. He left the document on the counter and walked out. And every man in that room watched him go and said nothing, because they all knew the same terrible truth. Victor Blackwell had the judges, the county clerk, and 3 territorial officials in his pocket, and fighting him alone was the same as not fighting at all. That was the valley Evelyn Carter arrived in 3 weeks later with 1 suitcase, $11, and absolutely no idea what she had walked into. If you've ever shown up somewhere with nothing but your own stubborn refusal to quit, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. All right. The stagecoach didn't stop for long. It slowed at the edge of the Blackthorn Valley Road. The driver called out, "Whitmore property, end of line for you, ma'am." And by the time Evelyn had her suitcase in hand and both feet on the ground, the coach was already moving again. She stood in the road and watched it go, the dust settling around her boots, and then she turned and looked at what was in front of her. She had expected a ranch. What she saw was a place that had been fighting to stay alive and losing the argument for some time. The main house was a 2-story timber structure that had once been painted white, though most of that paint had given up somewhere around 1880. The front porch sagged on the left side where a support post had cracked and never been replaced. The kitchen garden to the east of the house had gone to seed, the fence around it listing at odd angles. 2 of the barn's upper planks had separated from their framing, which meant every hard rain came through the roof at the same spot and had been doing so long enough to rot the hay beneath it. Evelyn took this in the way a person takes in damage, not with despair but with the trained eye of someone who has had to calculate what is fixable and what is already gone. She had grown up poor in Ohio, the 3rd of 7 children, raised by a mother who believed that a clean floor and a meal on the table were acts of dignity when you couldn't afford anything else. She had married Thomas Carter at 22, a good man with a bad lung that turned worse over 4 winters, and when he died 18 months ago, he left her with a small debt, a boarding house room she could no longer afford alone, and the particular grief of watching someone disappear slowly and being unable to stop it. She had answered the advertisement in the Helena paper because she needed work. The advertisement had read, "Housekeeper wanted, Blackthorn Valley Ranch. Caleb Whitmore, proprietor. 6 children. Previous applicants unsuitable. Inquire by post." The phrase "previous applicants unsuitable" had given her pause. She had written back anyway. Now she was standing in a rutted road with her suitcase at her feet, and she was beginning to understand what unsuitable might actually mean when you could see the place in person. The front door of the house opened before she reached the porch steps. A girl stood in the doorway, 16, maybe 17, with her mother's dark hair and her father's straight-set jaw. Evelyn would learn later that people in the valley said Mara Whitmore looked exactly like both her parents at once, which was its own kind of grief for everyone who saw her. She was wearing an apron over a dress that had been mended at both elbows, and she was carrying a dishcloth, and she was looking at Evelyn the way a person looks at something they have seen before and found disappointing. "You're the housekeeper," Mara said. It was not a question. "Evelyn Carter." Evelyn climbed the porch steps and held out her hand. Mara looked at it, then shook it once. "I'm Mara. I've been doing the cooking and the washing and most of the cleaning since March. I want you to know that up front." "I appreciate that." "The last woman lasted 11 days. The one before her lasted 3. "What happened to them?" Mara's expression didn't change. "They decided it was too much." Evelyn picked up her suitcase. "All right," she said. "Is your father home?" "He's in the lower pasture. He said to tell you where the room is and give you the list of what needs doing." Mara turned and walked back inside, and Evelyn followed her into the house. The interior was dim and smelled of wood smoke, and something underneath it that Evelyn recognized as the particular smell of a house where no one has had enough time to clean anything properly in a long while. The main room held a table that seated 8, a stone fireplace, 2 mismatched chairs, and a coat rack with so many jackets and hats piled on it that 2 of them had fallen to the floor and been left there. A pair of small boots sat in the middle of the room with no explanation. Through the kitchen doorway, Evelyn could see a pot on the stove that was clearly the source of the evening's supper, and not much else. "The bedroom's upstairs, first on the left," Mara said, without turning around. She had gone back to the pot and was stirring it with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this task so many times it has stopped being cooking and become something more like maintenance. "Sheets are clean. I did them yesterday." "Thank you." "There are 6 of us," Mara continued. "Me, then Thomas, he's 14, then Lily, she's 11. Daniel and Ruth are twins, they're 8, and Noah." She paused over the pot. "Noah's 5. He doesn't talk much right now." Evelyn set her suitcase by the stairs and came to stand near the kitchen doorway. "How long has he not been talking?" "Since April." Mara kept stirring. "Our mother died in February. Noah took it differently than the rest of us." Evelyn nodded. She did not say "I'm sorry" because she had learned in the 1.5 years since Thomas died that "I'm sorry" was often the least useful thing you could offer someone. And she was beginning to understand that this family had been receiving condolences for 8 months and finding them approximately as nourishing as air. "What's on the list?" she asked instead. Mara reached into her apron pocket and handed over a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was cramped and tilted slightly to the right, as though the man writing it had been in a hurry or hadn't been entirely comfortable putting words on paper and wanted to be done with it quickly. The list read, "Main house, full cleaning, upstairs and down. Windows, kitchen stores inventoried. We're short on flour and salt and likely other things. Children's clothing needs sorting. The younger ones have grown. Barn, I'll handle. Garden. If it can be saved, save it. Water barrel on the east side of the house needs the seam resealed before winter. Firewood stacked and covered. Thomas knows how, but has been slow about it. Evening meals at 6, breakfast at 5:30. I work early." Below that, in slightly different handwriting, more deliberate, as though he'd added it after a pause. "The children have had a hard year. They don't need someone to try to fix them. They need someone reliable." Evelyn folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She was still standing in the kitchen doorway when the back door opened and 3 children came in from outside at once, 2 of them arguing in the seamless, overlapping way that twins argue, where it's impossible to determine who started it, and neither of them particularly cares. And between them, a boy of 5 with a wooden horse tucked under his arm, who moved through the noise around him as though he were walking underwater. "She's here," one of the twins announced, stopping dead in the doorway and staring at Evelyn with the frank assessment that only 8-year-olds and certain judges can pull off without embarrassment. "Obviously," the other twin said. "I'm Daniel," said the first. "That's Ruth." "I know," Evelyn said. "Your sister told me." Ruth looked her up and down with a directness that reminded Evelyn of a much older woman. "How come you only have 1 suitcase?" "Because that's how much I have." Ruth considered this. "Did you leave the rest somewhere?" "No." "So that's everything?" "That's everything." Ruth and Daniel exchanged a look that communicated something neither of them put into words, and then they moved past her toward the stairs, and the room felt slightly less crowded. The 5-year-old, Noah, had stopped just inside the door and was standing there with the wooden horse held against his chest, watching Evelyn with the steady, unreadable attention of a child who has decided that watching is safer than anything else. "Hello, Noah," Evelyn said. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. She crouched down to his level, which put her at eye height with the wooden horse. It was a rough thing, carved by hand and painted in what had once been brown, though most of that paint had worn away. One ear had been broken off at some point and reattached with a small piece of wire that someone had bent with care. "Is that Ranger?" she asked. She had heard the name from no one. She simply guessed, because every child's most beloved object has a name, and it felt right to ask rather than to say nice horse the way adults always did. Noah's eyes widened slightly. He nodded once. "He looks like he's been on a long ride," Evelyn said. Noah looked down at the horse, then back up at her. Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one that hadn't quite decided to appear yet. Then Mara called from the kitchen that supper would be an hour, and Noah turned and went upstairs with his horse. And Evelyn straightened up and went to find where they kept the cleaning supplies. She was in the middle of carrying water up from the well when Caleb Whitmore came in from the lower pasture. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the back steps, the particular weight of a man who has been walking hard ground since before dawn. She was in the kitchen, and she didn't turn around immediately because she was in the middle of pouring, and she had learned that there was nothing to be gained from startling yourself just because someone else's arrival was loud. He came through the back door and stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected from the handwriting, which was an irrational way to form an expectation, and she knew it. Brought across the shoulders in the way of men who have done heavy outdoor work their whole lives rather than building themselves intentionally. Somewhere in his early 40s, though the year since his wife had died had written something into his face that made the age harder to read. Not older exactly, but denser, like grief had pressed itself into the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw and wasn't planning to move. He looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who has hired 4 housekeepers in 8 months and come to believe quietly and without drama that none of them are going to stay long enough to matter. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He nodded at the pot on the stove, which Mara had started and Evelyn had been monitoring. "Mara do that?" "She started it. I've been watching it." "She shouldn't have to, He stopped himself. "Supper's at 6. "I know. I read the list." He went to the wash basin and scrubbed his hands with the methodical thoroughness of a man who does it the same way every time. He didn't look at her while he did it. "The room all right?" "It's fine, thank you." "The children tell you the ground rules?" "Mara gave me the list." "That's not what I asked." Evelyn turned to look at him directly. "The older ones are watching to see how long I last," she said. "The younger ones are curious. Noah didn't speak to me, but he showed me the horse." Caleb's hand slowed slightly over the basin. Then he finished washing and reached for the towel. "Ranger," he said. "Yes." "He hasn't shown that to anyone since—" He didn't finish the sentence. He folded the towel over the edge of the basin with the same care he'd used on everything else and turned to face her. "What made you answer the advertisement?" "I needed work. Lots of positions available in Helena that don't require moving 60 miles out of town." "I know. So why here?" Evelyn considered how honest to be and then decided that a man who put the children needs someone reliable at the bottom of his list rather than the top, where it clearly belonged, was a man who communicated indirectly and would probably respond better to directness than to careful phrasing. "Because the advertisement said previous applicants were unsuitable," she said, "and I wanted to know what that meant. And because I'm a widow who's been living in one room for a year and a half, and I needed somewhere I could actually be useful rather than somewhere I could simply be employed." He looked at her for a moment. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I try to be." He nodded once, the same single nod his daughter had given her, and she noted that as a family trait, the Whitmores apparently confirmed things with a nod and kept the rest of their reactions to themselves. 6 o'clock, he said, and went upstairs. Evelyn turned back to the pot and stirred it once, and then she stood there in the kitchen of this stranger's house listening to the sounds of 6 children above her head and the wind beginning to pick up outside, and she thought, well, you're here now. You'd better figure out how to be useful. She did not know yet about Victor Blackwell. She did not know about the water rights document sitting in the general store, or the 3 other ranching families who had received similar notices, or the fact that the man who had sent those notices had been working for 2 years to clear out every independent operation in the valley so he could consolidate the land and the water access under a single holding company whose name he had already registered in 2 different territorial offices. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was the kitchen and the list and the single nod. She got to work. Supper that evening was the first time all 6 children sat at the table at the same moment in what Mara, later, would admit had been longer than she could specifically remember. This was not because Evelyn had done anything particularly remarkable. She had not orchestrated anything. She had simply made enough food for everyone and set the table and put it on at 6 o'clock the way the list said, and the children had come because supper was ready, which is the most reliable reason anyone ever comes to a table. They sat in a specific arrangement that told Evelyn a great deal about the family's internal geography. Mara at the end nearest the kitchen, clearly where she'd been sitting since February, positioned to get up and manage anything that needed managing. Thomas across from her, 14 and already carrying a version of his father's particular brand of silence. Lily between the twins, an arrangement that suggested she'd been placed there as a buffer. The twins on either side of her, their elbows occasionally threatening each other's space. And Noah at the far end, nearest the window, his wooden horse on the bench beside him. Caleb sat at the head of the table. Evelyn sat at the other end, which no one had assigned her. It was simply the only empty seat, and it placed her directly opposite Caleb, which she suspected was not ideal for either of them and couldn't be helped. The meal was quiet in the way that meals in grieving households are quiet. Not hostile, but weighted, as though everyone at the table is aware of a shape in the air above them that no one wants to name. Ruth, being 8 and therefore largely uninterested in shapes in the air, said, "How come you don't have any children?" "Ruth," Mara said, "I'm asking. You don't ask people that." "Why not?" Evelyn said, "I was married for 6 years and we didn't have any. That happens sometimes." Ruth considered this with the frank curiosity of someone filing it away. "Is your husband still alive?" "No, he died about a year and a half ago." "What from?" "Ruth?" Caleb's voice, level. "A sickness in his lungs," Evelyn said. "He was ill for a long time before he died." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel said, "Our mother died from fever," which was delivered with the particular matter-of-factness of a child who has been saying this sentence long enough that it has lost most of its sharp edges through repetition. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm sorry." Thomas, who had not said anything since supper started, said, "The last housekeeper said she was sorry too. She was gone inside 2 weeks." The statement landed in the middle of the table and sat there. Evelyn looked at him. Thomas was looking at his plate with the carefully arranged blankness of a boy who has said something pointed and is waiting to see what it costs him. "I'm not the last housekeeper," Evelyn said. "You don't know that yet," Thomas said. "Fair enough," Evelyn said. "Neither do you." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Very briefly, just a flicker. The way a closed door sometimes moves slightly when there's wind on the other side. And then it closed again, and he went back to eating. Caleb, across the table, was looking at her. She didn't look back at him. She passed the bread. After the children were in bed and the dishes were done, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the household ledger that she'd found in the cabinet beside the flour tin, and she went through it with the methodical care of someone who has managed her own finances on very little for long enough that numbers no longer intimidate her. What she found was not good. The ranch wasn't failing because Caleb Whitmore was incompetent. He clearly was not. The herd records were meticulous, the grazing rotations well planned, and the maintenance log, such as it existed, showed a man who knew his land and worked it hard. What the ledger showed was something subtler and more dangerous. The particular financial erosion that happens to a large operation when one person in it dies and the surviving person tries to absorb all of that person's work while continuing to do all of his own. Martha Whitmore, based on what Evelyn could piece together from the household accounts, had managed the domestic economy of the ranch with the same precision her husband brought to the cattle side. She had tracked every supply cost, negotiated every purchase, and kept the household running at a margin that allowed the ranch's income to stretch into investments. A new fence line the previous spring, the down payment on a second bull. Since February, those accounts had been kept sporadically at best. Mara had been doing what she could, but she was 16 and had been trying to raise 5 siblings simultaneously, and some of the supply costs had quietly doubled without anyone noticing because no one had been watching. The ranch was not in crisis yet, but it was heading toward one, and a water rights assessment fee of the kind Victor Blackwell had just announced for the county would accelerate that trajectory considerably. Evelyn sat with the ledger and the lamp in the quiet house for a long time that first night, making notes in the margin. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had found the problem and she was constitutionally unable to find a problem and look away from it. She was still sitting there when she heard a sound from the hallway. She looked up. Noah was standing in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with Ranger tucked against his chest, watching her with the careful attention she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of seeing the world. He hadn't made any sound to announce himself. He had simply appeared the way very young children appear when the house is quiet and something in them draws them toward the only lit room. "You should be in bed," Evelyn said, not unkindly. He looked at her, then at the lamp, then at her again. "Couldn't sleep?" she said, a slight shake of his head. She considered him for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair beside her and said, "Come sit with me for a little while." He crossed the kitchen in his bare feet and climbed into the chair and sat there with Ranger on his lap, watching Evelyn write in the margin of the ledger. After a minute, she stopped writing and just sat quietly, because she had learned in the years of watching Thomas decline and trying to make peace with what she could not change, that the most useful thing you can do for someone in pain is often just to be present without requiring anything from them. They sat that way for perhaps 20 minutes. Then Noah very slowly leaned sideways until his head was resting against her arm. Evelyn kept very still. She did not make anything of it. She simply sat there with the ledger and the lamp while the 5-year-old beside her gradually fell back to sleep, still holding his wooden horse, and the ranch house settled around them in the early Montana night. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know about the meetings Blackwell was already scheduling with the county assessor, or the quiet conversations he was having with the 2 commissioners who owed him favors, or the particular strategy he had developed over 2 years of watching which ranchers in this valley were most vulnerable and why. She didn't know that in 3 weeks, a notice would arrive at Blackthorn Ranch that would force Caleb Whitmore into a corner from which there seemed to be no exit. She didn't know that the valley's survival would eventually rest on something as unlikely as a widow with $11 and a talent for reading ledgers. But she was here. She was at the kitchen table in the lamp-lit dark with a sleeping child against her arm, and that was something. She had told Mara she wouldn't leave just because things were hard. She was already beginning to understand that this was the most dangerous kind of promise, the kind you mean sincerely without knowing yet what it will ask of you. She closed the ledger. She put out most of the lamp, and she sat in the near dark with Noah sleeping beside her and let the weight of the day settle into her bones. This woman who had arrived with nothing, in a valley that was already bracing itself against something she couldn't yet name. The morning after Evelyn arrived, she woke before 5. Not because the house was loud, it wasn't. The children were still asleep, and the ranch sat in the particular silence of early Montana autumn, when the temperature has dropped overnight and the air has that clean, hard quality that makes sound travel differently, like everything is being heard through glass. She woke because she had been waking before 5 for 18 months, ever since the last weeks of Thomas's illness, when the nights had required monitoring in a way that had permanently reset her body's internal clock. She dressed in the dark, went downstairs, and started the fire in the kitchen stove. She was breaking eggs when Caleb came down at 5:15. He stopped at the kitchen doorway the same way he had the night before, that brief pause of a man recalibrating to the fact of another person in a space that had been empty. And then he came in and went to the wash basin without saying anything. "Eggs and salt pork," Evelyn said. "There's not much else until I can get a proper look at the stores." "That's fine." "I looked at the household ledger last night." He turned slightly from the basin. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No, but it was in the cabinet and I was sitting at the table and I'm not able to find a problem and leave it alone." She turned the eggs. "You're paying nearly double what you should be for flour. Whoever's been buying it has been buying it at the general store in town instead of placing a monthly order through the mercantile in Helena." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Mara's been handling the shopping." "Mara's been handling everything. She's 16. She didn't know there was a better way because no one told her." Evelyn slid the eggs onto a plate. "I can set up the supply order this week if you tell me what you need." He sat down at the table and looked at the plate she put in front of him. "You've been keeping accounts before?" "For 6 years. My husband was sick for most of our marriage. Money was something we had to be careful with." He picked up his fork. Didn't say anything for a moment. Then, The water rights assessment notice. You see that in the ledger? No. What is it? He set the fork down and looked at the table for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how much to explain to someone he met yesterday, which is a calculation that has no comfortable answer when the information is important enough to matter. Man named Victor Blackwell, Caleb said. He's been buying up land in this valley for 2 years. Ranchers who can't keep up, he pressures them into selling. Ones who won't sell, he finds other ways. He picked up the fork again. Last week, he filed a water rights assessment through the county. Says every ranching operation on the valley's east side is overdue on their filing fees. 30 days to pay, or the rights revert to the county. Evelyn sat down across from him. How much is the fee? $240. She sat with that number for a moment. Based on what she'd seen in the ledger, $240 was approximately what the ranch had on hand after the upcoming supply costs, the ranch hand wages, and the winter feed purchase. It was not impossible. It was also not survivable if anything else went wrong in the same month. Is the fee legitimate? She asked. That's what no one can figure out. He ate for a moment. Blackwell's got people in the county office. Could be a real fee that nobody knew about. Could be something he invented and had someone file for him. Either way, the paper exists and it's got official seals on it. Who else received it? Henderson, Pruitt, couple of the smaller outfits? He looked at her. Why? Because if multiple properties receive the same notice on the same day, there's a way to fight it that's different from fighting it alone. She paused. Have you talked to the other ranchers? Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, which told her more than any words would have. We don't exactly... He stopped. There have been disagreements over the years. Water usage, fence lines. The valley's not what you'd call unified. I see. Blackwell probably knows that. He almost certainly counted on it, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her steadily. She couldn't tell if he was reassessing her or simply deciding something, but there was something different in his attention than there had been the night before. Something that had shifted slightly in the direction of actual listening rather than waiting for her to finish. Then Mara's footsteps on the stairs announced the day's real beginning, and Caleb stood up and put on his coat, and the conversation ended the way ranch morning conversations always end, which is abruptly and without resolution, because the animals don't wait. The first 2 weeks were harder than Evelyn had anticipated, though not in the ways she had expected. The physical work was demanding but manageable. She was not fragile, had never been, and the work of a large ranch household was not categorically different from the work she'd been doing in compressed form for years. She cleaned systematically, working through the house room by room, repairing what she could and making note of what required materials she didn't yet have. She established the supply order with the Helena Mercantile, which immediately reduced the household food costs by nearly a third. She repaired the kitchen garden fence using wire she found in the barn, coaxing the late-season soil into something that might yield a partial harvest before the frost arrived. None of this was the hard part. The hard part was Mara. Mara had been running this household for 8 months with the grim competence of someone who never wanted the job and couldn't walk away from it. And she had developed, in that time, a system of management that was entirely her own, idiosyncratic, sometimes inefficient, but hers. When Evelyn came in and began doing things differently, Mara experienced it not as relief, but as replacement. It came out in small ways first, a pot moved to a different burner, a cleaning schedule that conflicted with the one Mara had established, a suggestion about how to sort the children's laundry that Mara received with the polite tolerance of someone who has been doing it a different way and sees no reason to change. Then, on the 9th day, it came out directly. Evelyn was reorganizing the kitchen cabinet, a genuine improvement, creating more efficient access to the daily use items. When Mara came in from hanging laundry and stopped in the doorway with her basket against her hip and looked at what had been done. I had those arranged a specific way, Mara said. I know. I moved things around so the flour and salt are easier to reach. I knew where everything was. You did, Evelyn agreed. But now it's easier for the twins to reach the breakfast things without asking, which means you don't have to stop what you're doing every morning to get them down. Mara's mouth compressed into a thin line. I was managing. You were, Evelyn said. She turned to look at Mara directly. You've been managing everything. You've been managing better than most adults would in your position. I'm not here to tell you that you did it wrong. Then why do you keep changing things? Because managing and living aren't the same thing, Evelyn said. You're 17 years old. You shouldn't be the person this household depends on. Something moved across Mara's face, there and gone quickly, the way pain moves when you've become practiced at not letting it show. She set the laundry basket on the table with slightly more force than was strictly necessary. Someone had to be, she said. I know, Evelyn said, and you were. And now I'm here, and you don't have to be anymore. Mara looked at her. The expression on her face was complicated in the way that only a certain kind of exhaustion makes things complicated. The exhaustion of having carried something heavy for so long that you're no longer sure you know how to put it down, or if you even want to, because the weight has become the only thing that makes you feel like you're doing something that matters. You don't know how long you're staying, Mara said. No, Evelyn said. I don't. But I know I'm here today, and I know I'll be here tomorrow, and I know that's more than you had 2 weeks ago. Mara picked up the laundry basket and walked past her. At the doorway she paused. She didn't turn around. The twins like cinnamon in their oatmeal, she said. We have some left in the blue tin on the second shelf, the one you moved. Thank you, Evelyn said. Mara went upstairs. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she found the blue tin on the second shelf, exactly where she'd put it, and made a note to herself that it should probably go back to the first shelf, where Mara had been keeping it. Some things were not worth winning. The issue of Thomas, the 14-year-old, resolved itself through a different kind of friction. Thomas had appointed himself, at some point in the previous 8 months, as the household's primary skeptic regarding Evelyn specifically and adult reliability in general. He was not hostile. He was too controlled for hostility, which at 14 is either a sign of unusual self-possession or unusual damage, and Evelyn suspected it was some proportion of both. He was watchful. He completed his assigned tasks without complaint or engagement. He spoke when spoken to and occasionally added something dry and precise that suggested, underneath the careful blankness, a reasonably sharp mind that had decided observation was safer than participation. He also, Evelyn noticed, was supposed to be stacking and covering the firewood, a task the list had noted he knew how to do, and wasn't doing it. Not refusing, exactly. Just consistently finding other things that needed to be done at the moments when the firewood should have been getting done, so that by the end of the second week there was a cord and a half of wood sitting uncovered behind the barn, and the first hard rain would damage it. She mentioned it to Caleb, who said he would talk to Thomas. Then, the following day, Thomas stacked approximately a third of the wood and covered it, and stopped, like a negotiation conducted in physical labor. Evelyn thought about it for a day. Then she went out behind the barn herself, picked up the splitting maul, and started splitting the remaining rounds. She wasn't particularly efficient at it. Thomas had probably been splitting wood since he was 10 and could do in 20 minutes what would take her 45. But she was working at it steadily and without complaint when she heard the barn door open and didn't look up. Thomas stood behind her for a moment. "You're going to hurt your shoulder," he said. "Maybe," she said. She brought the maul down. "Hand me that one." A pause. Then he came forward and set the next round on the block. She split it. They worked without talking for 20 minutes, and then he took the maul from her. Not rudely, just efficiently, the way you take a tool from someone when you can see they're doing it wrong, and split the remaining rounds himself in about 8 minutes flat. "You could have just asked," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd do it for me," Evelyn said, "but I figured you'd step in if you watched me do it badly enough." Thomas looked at her. Something flickered in his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. "That's kind of manipulative." "It is," she agreed. He stacked the split wood in silence for a while. Then, "The last housekeeper cried when I was difficult." "Did it work?" "She was gone in 11 days, so I guess not for her." He stacked another piece. "The one before her yelled." "Did that work?" "She was gone in 3 days." He glanced at her sideways. "You're not going to cry or yell, are you?" "I haven't needed to yet," Evelyn said. Thomas stacked the last of the wood and covered it with the tarp, pulling the edges down with the practice of someone who's done it in cold wind before. He straightened up and looked at the covered pile for a moment. "My father works hard," he said. in case you didn't notice." I noticed. He's not mean. He doesn't know how to ask for help." Thomas picked up the maul and headed back toward the barn. At the door, he stopped. "My mother used to say the hardest thing in the world was getting a Whitmore to admit they needed something." He went inside. Evelyn stood by the woodpile in the thinning afternoon light and thought, well, that explains a few things. Eli, whom the outline had called quiet, but who in practice was simply a boy who processed the world through observation rather than speech, began to emerge by the third week in ways Evelyn hadn't quite expected. He was 11, the middle child in the older cluster, and he had the particular invisible quality of children who occupy the exact middle of a large family, too old to receive the attention the youngest get, too young to receive the respect the oldest command, and skilled enough at self-management to rarely generate the kind of trouble that forces adults to pay attention. He read when there were books available. He did his schoolwork without being asked and without asking for help. He appeared and disappeared from rooms so quietly that Evelyn sometimes startled when she turned around and found him already there. She would learn later that he had been, before February, a relatively talkative child. Not loud, that was the twins' department, but engaged, curious, the kind of kid who asked the sort of follow-up question that made adults realize they hadn't actually thought something all the way through. His teachers in town had noted it as a particular quality. His mother had apparently delighted in it. After February, he had simply become very quiet, not mute, the way Noah was. He spoke when necessary, answered questions, participated in family conversation at a functional level. He just no longer initiated anything. It was as though he had pulled all of his own threads back inside himself and couldn't find the end to pull them out again. Evelyn noticed it, and she did nothing about it directly because she had learned from Noah that pressing at closed things usually just pushed them more closed. What she did was leave a book on the kitchen table. Not pointedly. She wasn't even sure she had a conscious strategy. She had found a collection of natural history essays in the bottom of the cabinet under the stairs, spine intact but dusty, clearly unread for some time, and she had brought it upstairs to read herself one evening and then left it on the kitchen table when she came down for breakfast. Eli picked it up. He didn't say anything about it. He just had it in his hand when he came down for breakfast, and he kept it on the bench beside him during the meal, and when she cleared the plates, she noticed it was open to the chapter on geological formations in the Northern Territories. She said nothing. The next morning, there was a question. "It says the valley's on what used to be a lake bed," Eli said, from behind the book, without looking up. "From thousands of years ago." "That's what they think," Evelyn said. "So the water's still here, just underground." "Some of it." He looked up. "Then why does everyone fight over surface water rights? If there's water underground, couldn't they just—" He stopped himself, put the book down, went back to his oatmeal. Evelyn let a moment pass, then she said, "You'd need equipment to get to it. Wells that go deeper than most people have the money to drill." Eli absorbed this, nodded once. The conversation ended there, but it was a conversation, and the next morning he had another question, and the morning after that another one, and by the fourth week Evelyn had come to rely on the early morning kitchen as something she looked forward to in a way she hadn't expected. Eli's questions and the sound of the fire and the light coming in over the eastern ridge. It was not the same as having her own child. She was clear about that with herself, careful about it. These were not her children. This was not her house. She was the housekeeper, and she was doing the job she'd been hired to do, and the particular warmth that was developing in these mornings was a product of proximity and time, and the basic human tendency to form attachments when you are kind to people and they begin, slowly, to be kind back. She was clear about all of this. She was also, despite being clear, aware that she was failing to remain as professionally separate as she had perhaps intended when she arrived. The notice arrived on a Wednesday, carried by the county postal rider, who was also the kind of man who enjoyed being the person who knew things before other people did, and sometimes let that enjoyment show more than was strictly tasteful. He handed the envelope to Evelyn at the front door with a look that communicated, without stating, that he already knew what was inside it, and that he was sorry and also not entirely sorry. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and didn't open it. When Caleb came in from the east pasture at noon, it was sitting there where he could see it. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been waiting for and hoped wouldn't come. Then he picked it up and opened it and read it standing at the kitchen table. Evelyn was at the stove. She waited. "Water rights assessment," he said. "Same as the verbal notice from last month. Now it's official, $240. 30 days. She turned from the stove. "Can you pay it?" "If I pay it, I can't make the winter feed purchase." He set the letter on the table. "And if I can't make the winter feed purchase, I lose cattle over winter, which means spring roundup comes up short, which means—" He stopped. The sentence had a direction he didn't want to follow to its end. "Which means you're in the same position next year," Evelyn said. "Only worse." "Yes." She turned back to the stove, not because she needed to tend to anything, but because sometimes it is easier to think when your hands have something to do. "The Hendersons and the Pruitts got the same letter," she said. "Probably. Have you talked to them?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. She had learned enough about Caleb Whitmore in 3 weeks to know that the silence was not stubbornness exactly. It was more like a man who has spent so long being the one who handles things himself that he has lost the instinct to reach outward. Every burden he'd taken on alone had made the next one easier to pick up alone, and the pattern had become a wall between him and every other person in this valley who might otherwise have stood beside him. "Caleb," she said, and she used his given name without thinking about it, and then noticed that she had and kept going. "Blackwell filed on everyone at once. He did that because he knew that if you each receive the notice separately, you'll each spend 30 days trying to solve it separately, and by the time you've all discovered you can't, it'll be too late to work together." He was looking at her. "He wins because you let him turn one problem into 5, she said. "The only way to change that is to make it one problem again. The Hendersons and I have not been on good terms since when?" He looked at the letter on the table. "Since Martin Henderson let my east fence line drift 100 yards west over 3 years and then acted like it wasn't happening when I brought it up. That's a grudge about a fence line. It's a principle. Caleb." She said it with the same patience she used with Noah when he was frustrated. "The fence line or the ranch? Which one matters more right now?" The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove made its sounds. Outside, one of the ranch dogs barked once and stopped. Caleb picked up the letter and folded it back into its envelope and set it in the cabinet where he kept important papers. He didn't say anything. But that afternoon, Evelyn saw him ride out on his gray horse toward the Henderson property, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched until the trees took him, and she thought, well, that's something. He came back 2 hours later and didn't say what had happened, but he had the particular quality of a man who has done something difficult and is processing it quietly, which was different from the quality of a man who has done nothing, and she had learned to read the difference. 2 days later, Margaret Henderson came to the ranch. This was apparently remarkable enough that Mara, who was hanging laundry when the wagon came up the road, came directly into the kitchen to announce it with an expression that communicated the significance without explaining it. "Mrs. Henderson is here," Mara said. Evelyn looked at her. "Is that unusual?" "She hasn't been here since my mother died." Mara put down the basket. "She and my father had words at the fence line thing." Evelyn dried her hands and went to the front door. Margaret Henderson was a stout woman in her mid-40s with the weathered, direct quality of someone who has farmed difficult land in difficult weather for 20 years and arrived at a kind of physical honesty that made her impossible to misread. She climbed down from the wagon with the efficient grace of someone who has been climbing in and out of wagons since childhood and doesn't waste motion on it. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Evelyn. "You must be the new housekeeper," Margaret said. "Evelyn Carter." "My husband said Caleb wanted to talk about Blackwell's notices." Margaret looked at her steadily. "But I'm guessing this meeting was your idea." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Whitmore rode out to see you." "He rode out because something convinced him to," Margaret said. "Caleb Whitmore has been handling things alone since before his wife died. Something changed." She looked at Evelyn with the particular evaluation of a woman who has been navigating male stubbornness in frontier conditions long enough to recognize the leverage points. "Was it you?" "Come inside," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." Margaret came up the steps. At the door she paused. "I heard you went into the kitchen cabinet here and reorganized it." "I did." Mara's been buying flour at the general store for 8 months. She didn't know there was a better way. Margaret nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed. All right, she said, and came inside. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour, just the two of them, while Caleb was in the barn and the children were at their schoolwork upstairs. Margaret talked about the Henderson property's notice, the amount, the timing, and the particular difficulty of their situation. Her husband's health had been unreliable since the previous winter, and the notice had arrived at a moment when they had almost no financial flexibility. Evelyn listened. Then she asked about the other families who had received notices, and Margaret knew 2 of them and knew approximately who would speak to whom, and they worked through it like a problem with parts that needed to be counted before they could be solved. There are 5 properties affected, Margaret said. That we know of. Could be more. If they're all willing to meet, Evelyn said, one meeting could do what 5 separate conversations can't. And the first thing to determine is whether the assessment fee is legally legitimate. Blackwell's got the county clerk. He might, but the Territorial Records Office is in Helena, and it's a different jurisdiction. If the fee was invented, there won't be a corresponding entry in the Territorial Water Rights Registry. Margaret looked at her across the table. You know about Territorial Water Rights Registry? I know about records, Evelyn said, and I know about the way people who are trying to steal things have to create paperwork that matches in multiple places, and if they don't have access to all the places, it doesn't match. There was a pause. Where did you come from? Margaret said. Helena. Before that, Ohio. No, I mean, Margaret shook her head slightly. Caleb said you answered the advertisement, just needed work. That's true. Most people who just need work don't know about territorial registry cross-referencing. Evelyn looked at her evenly. My husband was a land surveyor before he got sick. I kept his books. You learn what's in them. Margaret absorbed this. Then she picked up her coffee and sat back slightly and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not quite approval. It was more tentative than that, more measured, but it was something in that direction. The Valley families don't agree on much, Margaret said. I know. Getting them in a room together might not go smoothly. It doesn't need to go smoothly, Evelyn said. It just needs to happen. Margaret set down her coffee. I'll talk to the Pruitts, she said. You get Caleb to talk to whoever he can still stand to talk to. That's a start, Evelyn said. After Margaret left, Evelyn sat at the table alone for a few minutes. The house had the particular midday quiet where all the morning's momentum has paused and the afternoon hasn't started yet. She could hear the twins' voices upstairs, some argument about something conducted in the theatrical overtones of children who are partially performing for each other's benefit. She could hear Lily reading aloud to herself, which she did sometimes, a habit she'd apparently had before and kept. She could hear Noah, not words. He still wasn't producing words reliably, and she had stopped expecting them to appear on any particular timeline. But from upstairs came the sound of small feet moving and a quiet rhythmic sound that she had learned over 3 weeks to recognize as the sound of Ranger being moved across a wooden surface, while Noah made a soft sound to himself that was almost but not quite narration. She sat with her hands around the coffee cup and felt, alongside the concern and the uncertainty and the considerable weight of what was gathering on the valley's horizon, something else, something warmer and more complicated, the particular sense of being in a place where your presence is beginning to matter. She had not planned to feel that. It was inconvenient. She was the housekeeper. She had $11 when she arrived, and she had replaced 4 women who hadn't stayed, and she was sitting in a kitchen with a list of problems any sensible person would find overwhelming, and she was feeling at home. She thought about Thomas at the woodpile. The hardest thing in the world is getting a Whitmore to admit they need something. And then the twins came thundering down the stairs about something involving a missing boot, and Lily followed at a more dignified pace with her book still in hand, and Noah appeared at the bottom of the stairs with Ranger tucked under his arm, and Mara came in from outside with a second basket of laundry, and the kitchen filled up with life the way kitchens do when a house has stopped being just walls around a wound. Evelyn stood up and went to settle the boot situation, and the afternoon began. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew on that particular afternoon, was that Victor Blackwell had received a report of his own. One of his hired men had been in the valley watching the road, and the report that came back to Blackwell described a wagon from the Henderson property making its way to Whitmore's ranch and staying for over an hour. Blackwell was a man who had built his operation on the reliable fragmentation of his targets. He had studied each ranching family in this valley for 2 years, had cataloged their grievances against each other, had timed his notices specifically to exploit the season when cash flow was tightest and cooperation was least likely. What the report described was not in the plan. He sent for his man Galt that evening and told him to pay closer attention to what was happening at Blackthorn Ranch. He did not know yet who had answered the advertisement in the Helena paper. He did not know that the woman currently reorganizing a kitchen cabinet and keeping a household ledger had a dead surveyor husband whose book she had kept, or that she had already identified the one legal mechanism that might unravel his entire scheme. He would find out. But that evening, in the Whitmore kitchen, Evelyn was helping Noah practice holding a pencil, and Mara was telling Lily something private and almost smiling about a boy from her schooling days. And Caleb came in from the barn and hung up his coat, and when he passed the kitchen doorway, he paused for just a moment at what he saw, and then kept walking. Later, much later, he would tell Evelyn that the moment he had understood something was genuinely changing was not the moment she confronted him about the Henderson fence, or reorganized the supply accounts, or sat with Noah in the middle of the night. It was that moment in the doorway. The kitchen full of his children, the sound of his daughter almost laughing. He had forgotten what it sounded like. The meeting happened on a Saturday. Caleb had spent 3 days riding between properties, which Evelyn knew not because he told her, but because she tracked his departures and returns, and the particular quality of his tiredness when he came back, the kind that comes from difficult conversations rather than physical labor, which sits differently in a man's shoulders. He spoke to 4 families in the end. 2 agreed to come immediately. 1 needed a day to think about it. The last, a rancher named Cord Sievers, who apparently had a history with Caleb that went back further than the Henderson fence line and was more complicated, said he'd show up but made clear it was the notice that was bringing him, not any goodwill toward Whitmore specifically. Evelyn thought that was honest, at least. She spent the Friday before the meeting writing out what she knew on 3 separate sheets of paper. Not a speech, not a plan that required everyone to agree before it could begin. Just the facts arranged in the order they needed to be understood, with the gaps clearly marked as gaps, because she had learned from watching Thomas that the fastest way to lose someone's trust was to present more certainty than you actually had. Mara found her at the table at 10 o'clock that night, still writing. "You should sleep," Mara said. "I will." Mara stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. In the 6 weeks since Evelyn had arrived, something had shifted between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the absence of active resistance, which at this stage was its own form of progress. Mara still moved through the house with the watchful economy of someone who has learned not to depend on anything staying, but she had stopped challenging Evelyn's presence in every small decision. And there were moments, rare, unannounced, when she simply talked, the way a person talks when they've been carrying something for a long time and forgotten that other people are available to listen. "Are they actually going to work together?" Mara asked. "The ranchers." "I don't know," Evelyn said. "What happens if they don't?" Evelyn looked at the papers in front of her. Then each family does what they can alone, and Blackwell gets what he wants from the ones who can't hold on. Mara was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother used to say the valley was like a family that had forgotten they were related." "Your mother sounds like she was a perceptive woman." She was. Mara's voice didn't change when she said it. She had made peace with that sentence, or at least reached the place where it didn't split her open to say it out loud. "She would have figured this out faster than you." Evelyn looked up at her. Mara's face was its usual careful composition, but there was something underneath it. Not quite vulnerability, but something adjacent to it. The quality of a person paying someone a compliment and watching to see if it's received without being turned into a moment. "Maybe," Evelyn said, "but I'm the one who's here." Mara nodded. Then she got herself a glass of water and went back upstairs, and Evelyn sat with her papers in the lamplight until she was satisfied that she had written down everything that mattered and nothing that didn't. They came on Saturday afternoon. 5 families in the end, which was more than Evelyn had counted on and fewer than she'd hoped for. The Hendersons arrived first. Margaret driving, her husband Frank in the wagon bed with his legs wrapped in a blanket, despite the fact that it wasn't yet cold enough for a blanket, which told Evelyn something about how the past winter had treated him. The Pruitts came next, old Silas with his missing fingers and his daughter-in-law Clara, who had apparently been doing most of the ranch work since Silas's son broke his leg in August. Cord Sievers arrived exactly when he said he would and sat as far from Caleb as the main room allowed, which was not very far and created a specific quality of tension that everyone in the room was aware of and none of them acknowledged. Two younger families came last, the Garretts and the Birch family, both of whom had received smaller notices than the others, but notices nonetheless, and both of whom had the particular alertness of people who are trying to determine whether this meeting is going to cost them something before they commit to it. The children had been sent upstairs. Evelyn could hear the twins above her head, which meant they were not listening at the top of the stairs. They were listening from the halfway landing, which was better positioned for acoustics and harder to see from below. She did not send them further up. They were old enough to understand that something important was happening, and there was a version of respect for that, even if it came in the form of deliberate selective blindness on her part. Caleb stood at the front of the room. He looked like a man who has done something he didn't want to do and committed to seeing it through, which was essentially accurate. "You all know why you're here," he said. "I'm not going to spend time on things everyone already knows." Cord Sievers, from his chair against the wall, said, "Let's hear it then." Caleb looked at Evelyn. She had not planned to be at the front of this. She had planned to give him the papers and let him present it. But the way he looked at her communicated something she had been watching him work toward for 6 weeks. An admission, quiet and private, that he needed her in the room in a different capacity than housekeeper. She stood up. She put the first sheet of paper on the table where everyone could see it, and without preamble she said, "The water rights assessment notice you received is dated October 3rd. All of you received it within 2 days of each other. That's not how legitimate county assessment notices work. They're issued by property, not by region, and they're processed individually over the course of weeks." She paused. "That means either someone in the county office issued all of these at the same time as a single batch, which would require either unusual efficiency or unusual coordination, or they were prepared in advance and released together deliberately." Frank Henderson from his chair said, "Blackwell's got the county clerk." "He may," Evelyn said, "but the county clerk doesn't have authority over the Territorial Water Rights Registry in Helena. The registry there records all legitimate water rights assessments for the territory, and they keep copies independent of what the county office holds." She put the second sheet on the table. "My husband was a land surveyor. I kept his books for 6 years. Water rights assessments always generate a corresponding entry in the Territorial Registry within 14 days of filing. Always. It's a requirement under territorial law." Silas Pruitt leaned forward. "So if we check the registry, if Blackwell manufactured the notices through the county clerk without filing corresponding paperwork in Helena, there's nothing in the registry," Evelyn said, "which means the notices aren't legally enforceable." The room was quiet for a moment. Clara Pruitt, who had not spoken yet, said, "How do we check the registry? Helena's a day and a half by horse." "2 people go," Evelyn said. "Not 5, not 1. 2, so there's a witness to what they find. They asked to see the Territorial Water Rights Assessment log for the current year, specifically for Blackthorn Valley properties. They write down what they find or don't find, and they get a signed copy from the registry clerk confirming what the record shows." "What if Blackwell's got someone in Helena too?" Cord Sievers said. "Then the copy is still official and it still says what it says," Evelyn said. "Paper signed by a territorial clerk is harder to argue with than a county notice with no corresponding registry entry." Sievers looked at Caleb. "She always talk like this?" "Getting used to it," Caleb said. Sievers made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was the closest thing to a thaw Evelyn had seen from him, and it was small enough that she didn't draw attention to it. Margaret Henderson said, "Even if we prove the notices are fraudulent, Blackwell doesn't stop. He'll find another angle." "He will," Evelyn agreed. "That's why the registry check is step 1, not the whole plan." She put the third sheet on the table. "The other things he's been doing, the fence damage on the Pruitt South line, the missing cattle from Henderson's East herd last spring, The broken sluice gate on Garrett's Upper Creek. Those things have to be documented, written down, dated, witnessed where possible. Because a pattern of coordinated damage across multiple properties is not a civil dispute. It's criminal interference, and it falls under territorial jurisdiction, not county. Elias Garrett, who hadn't spoken yet, said carefully, "You're talking about a formal complaint to the territorial office." "I'm talking about building the evidence for one," Evelyn said, "which is different from making the complaint before you're ready. Blackwell has money and connections. A complaint made too early, without enough documented evidence, gets dismissed, and he learns what you know before you're ready to use it." The room sat with that. Frank Henderson shifted in his chair, grimaced, and said, "The fence damage to the Pruitts was last spring. Some of that's going to be hard to document now." "Silas, do you remember roughly when it happened?" "April," Silas said, "week after Easter." "Did you repair it yourself?" "Me and my boy did." "Did you buy any materials to do it? Lumber? Wire?" Silas blinked. "At the general store, yeah. There's a purchase record there. If the date of the purchase matches the damage period, that's documentation. Not perfect, but something." She looked around the room. "Every repair you made because of something Blackwell's people did is a receipt somewhere. Every time you had to replace something, buy something, fix something, those records are part of the evidence." Margaret Henderson was watching her with the same expression she'd had at the kitchen table 6 weeks ago. Not quite approval, still too measured for that, but something that had moved past doubt into something more like reassessment. "Who goes to Helena?" Margaret asked. "Two people who can be gone 2 days and whose absence won't put their operation in crisis," Evelyn said. She looked at Clara Pruitt and Elias Garrett. "If those two families can spare someone each, that's the pair." Clara said, "I can go." Garrett said, "I can send my wife. She's better with clerks than I am, honestly." From the back of the room, Cord Sievers made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh again. His wife, apparently, was not. Caleb, who had been standing at the side of the room for most of this with his arms crossed, in the particular posture of a man who is trying not to look like he's been managed, said, "I want to be clear about something. This plan requires trust between people who haven't had much of it. If one of us talks to the wrong person before we're ready or backs out when it gets harder than expected, it hurts everyone else." He looked specifically at no one, but the weight of it landed on Cord Sievers, who received it without expression. "I'm asking you to hold whatever disagreements we have with each other separate from this. Whatever comes after, whatever is still unresolved between any of us." And here he did look at Sievers briefly. "Can stay unresolved until this is finished." Sievers was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers on the table. Then he looked at Evelyn. "The fence line that's been creeping west," he said. "That's not Blackwell. That's a different conversation." "It is," Caleb said. "And you're willing to leave it separate." "I'm willing to leave it separate until this is done." A pause. "After that, we talk about it like men." Sievers looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded. Single nod. Like all the Whitmores and their stubbornness and their one-nod affirmations had somehow transmitted into the neighbors too, through years of proximity. "All right," Sievers said. The meeting broke up an hour later. People filed out to their wagons with the particular manner of a group that has agreed to something difficult and is slightly surprised to find that they agreed. Margaret Henderson clasped Evelyn's hand at the door. Not warmly, not effusively, but firmly, with the grip of someone communicating something they're not saying aloud. Clara Pruitt and Helen Garrett would leave for Helena on Monday morning. Caleb stood on the porch after the last wagon was gone and looked out at the road in the settling dusk. Evelyn came and stood beside him with 2 cups of coffee, and he took his without looking at her. "That went better than I expected," he said. "It went well enough." "Sievers?" He shook his head slightly. "He came," Evelyn said. "That's something. He came because he's scared of Blackwell, not because he's changed." "People change for different reasons," she said. "The reason matters less than the result, at least at the beginning." Caleb drank his coffee. The ranch was quiet around them. From upstairs came the sound of the twins, who had clearly abandoned the pretense of staying on the landing and were now running in the hallway in the specific way that indicated someone was going to fall down and be upset about it within approximately 3 minutes. "Where did you learn to do that?" Caleb said. She looked at him. "Do what?" "Talk to a room full of people who don't trust each other and make them feel like they're choosing to cooperate rather than being organized." Evelyn considered this. "I don't know that I learned it anywhere," she said finally. "I think when Thomas was sick, I had to talk to a lot of people who didn't want to tell me the truth about what was happening. Doctors who talked around things. Landlords who weren't straightforward about what we owed. I got used to finding the thing everyone needed to agree on first, before anything else." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "It sounds lonely." The word surprised her, not because it was wrong, but because she hadn't expected him to say it. She had the brief, disorienting experience of being seen accurately by someone she'd been carefully watching for weeks, without being sure she was being watched back. "It was," she said. "It was very lonely." He nodded and drank the rest of his coffee and went inside. She stood on the porch alone for a moment longer. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called once, high and thin. The stars over the Montana ridge were doing what Montana stars did, filling up the sky in a way that felt excessive, almost argumentative, as if the night were making a point about scale. She went inside. The Thursday after the meeting, Galt came. Evelyn saw him from the kitchen window first. A man on a dark horse coming up the road at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, which in Evelyn's experience was more unsettling than speed, because it meant someone who has no reason to rush because they already have the advantage. He was thick-shouldered, with a hat pulled low, and he had the quality of a man who has been hired specifically because he is the kind of man who is effective at communicating threat without doing anything that can be described in a court. Caleb was in the barn. Thomas was with him. Evelyn went to the front door before Galt reached the porch steps. He pulled up his horse and looked down at her from the saddle, with the particular expression of a man who is expecting to find someone else at the door and is recalibrating. "Whitmore home?" he said. "He's working," Evelyn said. "Can I help you?" "I'll wait." "What's your business?" Galt looked at her steadily. He had the eyes of someone who has spent a long time assessing other people's resolve and can tell within a few seconds roughly how much resistance they're likely to offer. He was doing that assessment now, and whatever he concluded, he adjusted his tone slightly. Not respectfully, but with a recalibration that suggested he was taking her slightly more seriously than he'd intended. "Victor Blackwell sends his regards," Galt said. "And a reminder about the assessment deadline. 2 weeks. "Mr. Whitmore is aware of the deadline," Evelyn said. "Just making sure. Things get busy on a ranch. Easy to lose track of dates." "Not here." Galt's gaze moved past her to the house, the way a person looks at something they're appraising rather than admiring. Then it came back to her. "New housekeeper?" he said. "Yes." "Heard that. You're not from the valley." "I'm not." "Smart woman would think carefully about getting too involved in valley business," Galt said, "especially business that's already complicated." The threat was light, practiced, the kind of thing that could be described afterward as simply a friendly observation. Evelyn recognized the form. She had seen it used by landlords and by a particular doctor in Helena who hadn't wanted her asking too many questions. "I appreciate the advice," she said pleasantly. "Is there anything else?" Galt looked at her for another moment. Then he turned his horse without answering and rode back out the way he'd come, at the same unhurried pace, and Evelyn stood at the door and watched him go and didn't move until the sound of the horse was gone. She was still standing there when Caleb came out of the barn. He looked at the road, then at her. "Who was that?" "A man named Galt. He works for Blackwell." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What did he want?" "To remind you about the deadline and to see what he could find out about what's happening here." She turned from the door. "He'll report back that the housekeeper answered the door and didn't tell him anything useful." "He threatened you?" "Not in any way you could prove." She went back to the kitchen. "He's going to go back and tell Blackwell that something is different at this ranch. We probably have less time than we thought." Caleb followed her to the kitchen doorway. "Helena," he said. "How long until Claire and Mrs. Garrett come back?" "Today's Thursday. They left Monday. If the road stayed passable, they should be back Saturday. And if they find what you think they'll find, then we have a document signed by a territorial clerk saying the assessment notices have no corresponding registry entries, Evelyn said, which means they're fraudulent. She paused. But we need more than that. One piece of paper isn't enough. Blackwell will say it's a clerical oversight, that the registry entry was delayed, that there was a processing error. He'll buy time with that argument while he finds another way to apply pressure. So what else do we need? She sat down at the table. The incidents, the fence damage, the cattle, the sluice gate. Someone needs to talk to each family and compile everything they can remember. Dates, amounts, any purchase records or repair receipts, and anyone who saw anything, any ranch hands, any neighbors who happened to be nearby. That's a lot of conversations. Yes. Caleb sat down across from her, which was unusual for this time of day. Usually he was back out the door within 5 minutes of coming in. He put both hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Galt's going to come back, he said. He will. And next time it probably won't be just a reminder. No. He looked at her across the table. There was something in his expression that she had not seen before. Not quite fear, because Caleb Whitmore's relationship with fear appeared to be something he'd processed into a different substance over years of difficulty. The way certain things get pressed under enough heat and weight that they come out the other side as something harder. It was more like clarity. The look of a man who has been managing his way through a situation alone and has arrived at the edge of what that approach can handle. "Evelyn," he said. Then he stopped. She waited. "What you're doing, what you've been doing since you got here, the ledger, the meeting, the Helena thing." He seemed to be choosing words with care that he didn't usually apply to conversation. "I want you to know that I see it. I don't take it for granted." She looked at him steadily. "I know you don't." "I'm not good at saying Caleb." She said it quietly. "I know. You don't need to." He nodded. Once, in the Whitmore way. Then he got up and went back outside. Clara Pruitt and Helen Garrett came back Saturday morning, 2 hours before noon. They came together in the Garrett wagon, which told Evelyn that they had not come back separately as they'd left, meaning the 2 days in Helena had produced something closer to solidarity than two women who barely knew each other usually managed in 48 hours on the road. Helen Garrett came through the kitchen door first and put a folded document on the table without saying anything. Clara came in behind her and pulled off her traveling gloves and sat down. "Nothing," Clara said. "There is nothing in the territorial registry for Blackthorn Valley water rights assessments for this year." The clerk checked the full year's log. Not one entry. The document was a signed statement from the registry clerk confirming exactly that, with the territorial seal on it, dated 2 days ago. Evelyn picked it up and read it carefully. Then she put it down. "Did the clerk ask why you wanted to know?" Caleb asked. "He did," Helen said. "We told him we were verifying a notice we'd received against the registry entry the way we were entitled to do. He didn't ask more than that." She paused. "Though he did say, while he was looking, that they hadn't received any county filings from the Blackthorn Valley area at all this year. He said it as an observation, like he wasn't sure what to make of it." "He was telling you something without saying it directly," Evelyn said. "That's what I thought," Helen said. Caleb looked at the document on the table. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You were right." "The notices are fraudulent," Evelyn said. "Now we need to figure out how to use that without giving Blackwell time to manufacture a cover." The plan they assembled over the next 3 days was pieced together in fragments. Conversations at the kitchen table, a note carried by Ryder to the Hendersons, a 2-hour session with Silas Pruitt, who turned out to have kept a handwritten log of every unusual incident on his property for the past 3 years, a habit his late wife had apparently started and he'd continued without fully understanding why, until now. Silas's log was better than anything Evelyn could have constructed from memory and receipts. It had dates. It had descriptions. It had the names of 2 Blackwell Ranch hands he'd recognized by sight on a road that had no reason to take them past his property. It was not legal proof in any formal sense, but it was the kind of document that, combined with the registry statement and the corroborating records from the other families, created a picture that was very difficult to explain away. Evelyn wrote everything into a consolidated account over 2 evenings. She wrote it plainly, in the order it had happened, without argument or accusation, just what had occurred, when, and who could attest to it. She gave it to Caleb on the 3rd evening. He read it through without speaking and then set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "This goes to the Territorial Marshal's office," he said. "Yes. And in the meantime, we hold on to the registry statement and don't tell Blackwell we have it." "As long as possible," Evelyn said. "Once he knows we have it, he'll move quickly. We need to have the consolidated report to the Territorial office before he can interfere with anyone involved." Caleb was quiet. Outside, the first serious cold front of autumn had come through during the night and left a frost on the ground that was still there at noon. The horse's breath had been visible in the barn that morning. The water barrel on the east side of the house, the one with the failing seam that Evelyn had repaired in her first week, had held through the freeze without leaking. Small things, but she had stopped discounting small things. "There's something else," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Galt came back," he said. "Yesterday evening, when you were putting the children to bed." She was very still. "I didn't know that. I didn't tell you until I'd thought about it." He looked at the consolidated report on the table. He said Blackwell's made some investments in this valley, legal ones, property adjacent to several of the ranches. His voice was even. He said the assessments are just the beginning, said Blackwell's willing to be patient. "He's trying to get you to sell early," Evelyn said, "before the pressure gets worse." "Yes." "And what did you say?" Caleb looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of something that took effort to show, not vulnerability exactly, but the facing of it. "I told him the ranch wasn't for sale," Caleb said, "at any price, and that if Blackwell was counting on the valley being fragmented, he'd miscalculated." Evelyn absorbed this. "He'll tell Blackwell that." "I expect so. It will accelerate things." "I know." She looked at the report on the table. They were close enough that she could see the shape of the resolution if nothing else went wrong. But she had spent enough time watching difficult situations to know that if nothing else goes wrong was not a strategy. It was a wish. She was right to be cautious, because 3 days later, in the dead middle of a Tuesday night, the smell of smoke came through the walls of the house, and Mara screamed from upstairs, and by the time Evelyn reached the window, the barn was already burning, and Noah was not in his bed. She didn't think. That was the thing she would remember later. Not the decision, because there was no decision, just the absence of one, just her feet already moving down the hallway before her mind had finished forming the sentence, "Noah is not in his bed." The smoke smell was thicker at the bottom of the stairs. The orange light coming through the windows on the east side of the house made the main room look like the inside of something that was already gone. Caleb came from his bedroom at the same moment she hit the bottom step, and they nearly collided in the dark, and he grabbed her arm to steady both of them. "The barn," he said. "Noah's not upstairs." The words landed on him the way a physical blow lands, the brief suspension of everything before the response. Then he was at the front door and she was right behind him, and they came out onto the porch and the barn was fully alight, the east wall gone already, the roof peak beginning to show fire through the shingles, the sound of it enormous in the night quiet, a sound that was not like anything else, not wind, not water, something alive and consuming and completely indifferent to everything in its path. The horses were screaming inside. Caleb went for the barn doors. Evelyn went for the barn doors too. "Get back in the house," Caleb said, without looking at her, already pulling at the near door which had warped slightly in the heat. "Noah," she said, "I'll get him. You don't know where he is in there." She was at the other door, pulling with him. "2 people find him faster than 1. He looked at her for 1 second. 1. Then the door gave and the smoke came out in a wall, and they both turned their faces from it, and Caleb went in and Evelyn went in behind him. The interior of the barn was not what she expected, which was fully engulfed. The west side, the stall side where the horses were, was still relatively clear, the smoke heavy but the fire not yet there. The east wall and the hayloft above the east side where the worst of it was, and the roof above the loft beginning to go. The horses were pulling against their ties in the way horses do when they are terrified, which is completely and without logic, and the noise they made was terrible. Caleb went to the horses. She understood this, say, the horses would die and take everything else with them if they panicked and pulled the stalls apart. And she went the other way, deeper into the barn, calling Noah's name. The smoke was lower near the floor. She had enough presence of mind to crouch as she moved, one hand against the wall to keep her bearings, calling his name between breaths that she tried to keep shallow and not always managed. She found him in the last stall on the west side. He was in the corner of the empty stall, the one that had been unused since before she arrived, the one with the broken latch she had added to the repair list 3 weeks ago and not yet gotten to. He was sitting in the corner with his back against the boards, and Ranger held against his chest, and his face turned into his own knees, the posture of a child who has learned to make himself as small as possible when the world becomes too large. Noah. She dropped to her knees in the hay beside him. Noah, I need you to look at me. He didn't look up. I'm here, she said. It's Evelyn. I need you to take my hand. His hand came out from around the horse, reached sideways in the dark, found hers. She gripped it hard. Good, she said. Good. We're going now. Hold Ranger and hold my hand and don't let go. She got him up without letting go of his hand. He was unsteady, either from the smoke or from whatever had brought him to the barn in the first place. She would learn later that he had heard the first sound of the fire starting, sometime before the rest of the house woke, and had come for Ranger because the horse's stall was on the east side, where the fire was first, and the 5-year-old logic of it was clear and heartbreaking. Ranger was in danger, and Noah had come to get him out. Ranger's stall had already been burning when Noah arrived. The boy had taken the carved horse from its shelf in the stall doorway and retreated to the far corner of the empty stall and stayed there. Evelyn didn't know any of this yet. What she knew was the heat increasing from above and the smoke thickening and the child's hand in hers, and she moved them both along the west wall, staying low, following the wall back toward the doors. The roof gave way above the east hayloft with a sound like a percussion instrument the size of the sky. The east side of the barn collapsed inward in a cascade of burning timber, and the wave of heat that came with it was physical, like being pushed, and Evelyn put Noah in front of her and kept her hand on his back and kept moving toward where the doors had to be. Caleb met them 12 feet from the door. He had the 2 horses, both out of their stalls, both still panicking, but moving. And when he saw Evelyn and Noah coming through the smoke, he made a sound she would not be able to describe later. Not a word, just a sound. He took Noah from her arms as they came through the door, and Evelyn came out last and went immediately to her knees on the cold ground, because her legs had been negotiating with her since roughly the moment she'd found Noah and were now declining to continue. She stayed on her knees in the frost-stiffened dirt with her hands on the ground and breathed, just breathed. The cold air was startling and clean, and she took in as much of it as her body would accept. Caleb was on the ground beside her with Noah in his arms, and she could hear him talking to the boy. Low, steady, the same tone she imagined he used with the horses. And Noah was making a sound she had never heard him make, a thin, high sound that was not a word but was also not nothing. And after a moment she realized the sound was the beginning of crying, which was the first sustained emotional expression she had heard from him that wasn't silence. Thomas was there, and Mara, and the twins clutched together on the porch, and Lily crying openly with none of the self-consciousness she usually maintained. They had all come out of the house at some point. She didn't know when. She had lost track of everything outside the barn while she was inside it. Thomas was already running for the water pump. It was too late for the barn. Everyone could see that. But the house was close enough that a change in wind could carry embers, and Thomas understood this without being told, and Mara was already at the pump beside him, and Evelyn thought, from the ground where she was still kneeling, "Look at them. Look at what they've become." The barn burned through the rest of the night. The families started arriving before dawn. She didn't know who had sent word or how, only that when the first gray light came over the ridge, the Henderson wagon was coming up the road, and behind it the Pruitts, and by the time it was fully light, there were 4 families on the Whitmore property, and the men were already assessing the barn's remains for what could be salvaged, and Margaret Henderson had taken over the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who considers it her personal failure if anyone within sight of her is cold and unfed. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee she hadn't made herself, and Noah was asleep in the chair beside her. Actually asleep, deeply, the way children sleep after surviving something that has burned through every reserve they have. And Mara sat across from her and didn't say anything, just sat there, present, which was its own kind of communication. After a while, Mara said, "You went in after him." "Yes." "Before my father even knew he was in there." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "I knew where his room was. I checked it on the way down." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Still," she paused, "I want you to know. I know I wasn't easy when you first came." "You were exactly as hard as you needed to be," Evelyn said. "That's different from difficult." Mara looked at her steadily. Something had shifted in her face, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that makes a good story, just the quiet settling of something that had been braced for a long time and was now incrementally releasing. "You're not going to leave," Mara said. It was not a question this time. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to leave." Noah stirred in the chair beside her, and Mara reached over without thinking and tucked the coat more securely around him, and neither of them mentioned it, and the morning went on. Caleb found her after the other families had eaten and the assessment of the barn damage was complete, which meant after approximately 3 hours of focused practical activity, during which everyone had somewhere specific to be and something specific to do. He found her at the water barrel on the east side of the house, the one she'd resealed in her first week, checking it in the way she checked things that had been near heat, the methodical assessment of someone who was making sure the small repairs held. He stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. His face was smoke-darkened, and he had a burn on his left forearm from the horses. Not serious, but visible, and he had clearly not slept. "She's holding," Evelyn said, about the barrel. "Good," he said. Silence for a moment. The yard was still active. Men moving materials, a pair of ranch hands from the Henderson property helping with what remained of the barn structure. The twins chasing each other around the periphery of all of it in the particular way of children who are processing trauma through motion. "I know it was Galt," Caleb said, "or someone Blackwell sent. The fire started in 2 places. You can see it in the burn pattern. 2 separate points on the east wall." Evelyn nodded. "That's arson," he said. "Yes. That changes what we have." "It changes it considerably," she said. "Fraudulent assessment notices are civil and possibly criminal, depending on the territorial prosecutor. Arson is unambiguously criminal, and arson on a property that had an outstanding assessment notice from the same man. That's a pattern that a territorial marshal is going to want to investigate." Caleb looked at the ruined barn. The structure had collapsed inward on itself and was now a blackened geometry of fallen timber and ash, still sending up thin threads of smoke in the cold morning air. "We need to document the burn pattern before anything gets moved," he said. "I know. I asked Thomas to draw it when the light was better this morning." He did. He also talked to both ranch hands who came out first, and they'll confirm what they saw. Caleb turned to look at her. There was something in his expression that was past the practical, past the problem-solving register that had been carrying both of them through the night and the morning. Something more than that, and older than that. "You went into a burning building," he said. She met his eyes. "Noah was in there." "Evelyn." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, stripped of the management, of the careful Whitmore distance. "You could have been killed." "So could he," she said. "And he's 5. That's not—" He stopped, ran one hand across his face in the gesture she'd come to recognize as what he did when he was trying to compose himself rather than just react. "I couldn't find you for a minute. You were both inside and I couldn't see you and I couldn't—" He stopped again. She looked at him. The morning light was full by now, and cold and flat, the kind of light that doesn't do anyone any favors. He looked like a man who had been frightened in a way that had reached past the surface, past the years of hardening, and found something underneath that was still soft and capable of real fear. She said, "I know." He looked at her for a long moment, then, carefully, like a man picking up something he was worried about dropping. "Thank you. You don't have to meet—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. She held his gaze. There was nothing complicated in the moment, and also everything complicated in the moment, which is the way certain things are when you've been living in close proximity to someone through difficult circumstances, and the difficulty has made the proximity into something else. "You're welcome," she said. He nodded, single nod, and went back to the yard. The consolidated report that Evelyn had written over 3 evenings now needed to be extended. She did it that night, at the kitchen table, after the visiting families had gone home and the children were in bed, adding a precise description of the fire, the timeline, the burn pattern Thomas had documented, the statement from the ranch hands, the assessment notice date, and the clear chronological link between Caleb's conversation with Galt and the fire 3 days later. The picture it created was no longer ambiguous. She wrote a cover letter addressed to the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena. She wrote it carefully, without heat, without accusation that outran the evidence. Just the facts in the order they had happened, with the documents attached, and a request for investigation under territorial jurisdiction. She was sealing it when Caleb came downstairs. He stopped at the kitchen doorway when he saw the lamp. "You're still up," he said. "Almost finished." He came in and sat across from her and looked at the envelope. "When does it go?" "Thomas said he'd ride to town tomorrow morning to post it. It'll reach Helena in 3 days." She put down the pen. "After that we wait. And we don't tell anyone it's been sent until we have to." Caleb nodded. He looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he said, "There's something I need to tell you about Galt." She looked at him. "He's been in the valley a long time," Caleb said. "Before he worked for Blackwell, he worked for himself. Small operation, failed. He's got a particular grudge against ranchers who survived what he didn't." He paused. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for him. I'm telling you because it means he takes things personally in a way that Blackwell probably doesn't fully control. Blackwell might have authorized pressure. Galt may have decided to burn the barn on his own." Evelyn absorbed this. "Does that change anything legally?" "Might change who gets held responsible for what." He paused. "And it means Galt might act again, independent of whether Blackwell tells him to. So we might have 2 problems instead of 1. "Yes." She thought about this. "Is there anyone who would know where Galt stays when he's not at the Blackwell property?" Caleb looked at her with a slight expression she had learned meant he was recalibrating something. "Why?" "Because if the Territorial Marshal's investigation starts and Galt feels like he's being cornered, he's more unpredictable than Blackwell. And if we know where he is, we're not going after Galt," Caleb said, firm and flat. "I'm not suggesting going after him," Evelyn said. "I'm suggesting knowing where he is. There's a difference between confronting someone and not being surprised by them." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cord Severs would know. He and Galt have crossed paths before. Not friendly, but Severs keeps track of people he doesn't trust." "Would Severs tell you?" "Since the meeting?" He considered this. "Maybe. We're not friends, but we're not what we were before either." "That's enough," Evelyn said. She stood up and put the envelope on the cabinet shelf where the important papers were kept. Caleb watched her do it with the look of a man who is getting used to something he didn't plan on getting used to. "One thing at a time," he said. "One thing at a time," she agreed. She went to the door and then stopped because there was something she had been turning over all day, and she had decided the exhaustion of the morning had removed her usual caution about saying difficult things. "Noah spoke today," she said. Caleb went very still. "Not much," she said. "He said 2 words. He said Ranger's safe, after he woke up from sleeping in the chair." She paused. "He said it to Mara, not to me. I was across the room and I'm not even sure he knew I heard." Caleb looked at the cabinet shelf where the envelope was sitting. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she began to wonder if she should have waited to tell him, picked a better time. But there was never a better time for certain things, and she had learned not to wait for it. "He hasn't said a full sentence," Caleb said. His voice was careful the way voices get careful when the thing underneath them is large. "Since February." "I know." 2 words is..." He stopped, put one hand on the back of the chair in front of him, the way people put their hands on solid things when they need something to hold on to. 2 words is a lot. "It is," Evelyn said. He stood with his hand on the chair for a moment. She let him have it without filling it. "Go to sleep," he said finally. "We've got a lot of days ahead." She went upstairs. She lay in the dark of her room, the first room on the left, clean sheets that she had changed herself every week since arriving, and listened to the house settle around her. The sound of 6 children sleeping, distributed through the rooms above. The sound of Caleb, still downstairs for a while, his footsteps quiet across the floorboards. The sound of the Montana night outside, cold and immense and indifferent. She thought about the envelope on the shelf, about Galt and the burn pattern, and the territorial marshal 3 days away by post, about Cord Sievers, who knew things that might matter, about the consolidated report with its careful, unemotional accounting of everything that had been done to this valley by a man who had decided that other people's lives were an inconvenience to his ambition. She thought about Noah's 2 words, small and whole and astonishing. And she thought about what Thomas had said at the woodpile, on an afternoon that felt much longer ago than it was. The hardest thing in the world is getting a Whitmore to admit they need something. She thought Caleb was getting there. She thought they all were. The week after the fire was its own kind of test. The barn was gone, but the livestock had survived. The horses that Caleb had managed to get out, the cattle in the winter pasture that were far enough from the fire that they'd only been startled rather than injured. What was gone was the structure itself and the hay stores in the east loft, which was approximately a third of what they'd planned for winter feed. The neighboring families answered this problem without being asked. It was Margaret Henderson who organized it, which surprised Evelyn and apparently surprised no one who knew Margaret. The morning after the fire, Margaret had driven home and apparently spent the afternoon making a specific kind of conversation with specific people in the valley, because by Wednesday a wagon arrived at Whitmore's gate with hay from the Henderson upper field, and by Thursday the Pruitts sent 2 men and lumber from their own supply, and by the following Monday there was a foundation where the old barn had been, new posts set, and 6 men from 4 different families working on the framing, while their wives kept the Whitmore kitchen fed in the manner of women who deal with disaster through the production of food. Caleb watched this with the expression of a man who has held a belief about the world for a long time, and is watching it require revision in real time. Evelyn watched him watching it and said nothing. On the Thursday following the fire, Cord Sievers arrived alone. No wagon, just his horse, tied at the gate, and Sievers at the door with his hat in his hand, which Evelyn suspected was unusual for him based on the slight awkwardness with which he was holding it. She let him in and called Caleb from the barn. They sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Sievers said, "I know where Galt's been staying. There's a line cabin on the old Mercer property, east of the county road. Nobody's used it in years. One of my hands saw his horse there 2 nights before the fire." Caleb sat with this. "You're sure?" "My hand's sure." He described the horse. "It's Galt's." "Does Blackwell know about the cabin?" "Doubt it. It's not on any property Blackwell owns. It's old Mercer land. The estate's still unsettled. Galt's using it without anyone's permission." Evelyn said, "He's not staying at the Blackwell property, which means he's operating more independently than Blackwell knows." "That's what I figure," Sievers said. Caleb looked at the table for a moment, then, "Why are you bringing this to me, Cord?" Sievers was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat once in his hands. "Because the fence line disagreement we've got, I've been sitting on it for 2 years, and the barn burning down put things in a different order for me." He looked at Caleb steadily. "And because my property's on the list too, and I'd rather face what's coming as part of something than alone." He paused. "And because what your housekeeper put together at that meeting was the first time I've seen anyone in this valley think about Blackwell correctly." He said housekeeper with a slight pause before it, the way a person says a word they're not entirely sure applies anymore. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She said, "The information about the cabin goes in the report to the territorial marshal, along with your hand's witness account of the horse, with a date." She looked at Sievers. "Would he sign a statement?" "He would," Sievers said. "He's not afraid of Galt." "Good." She stood up to get paper. "Then let's write it down while it's in front of us." The response from the territorial marshal's office came faster than she had expected. 12 days after Thomas posted the envelope, a writer came to the ranch with a letter bearing the territorial seal. The letter said that the marshal's office had received the consolidated report and the associated documents, that an investigator had been dispatched to review the territorial water rights registry personally, and that the office was requesting that all affected property owners make themselves available for interview in the coming weeks. It also said, in the particular measured language of official correspondence that was trying to communicate something without committing to it prematurely, that the evidence provided had been reviewed by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office and was considered sufficient to open a formal investigation under territorial law. Caleb read it twice. Then he put it on the table and looked at it. "It's starting," he said. "It's starting," Evelyn agreed. It was not finished. She was clear about that with herself. An investigation opening was not an investigation concluding. Blackwell had money and connections and the particular resourcefulness of a man who had been building his operation for years, and he would fight the investigation the way he fought everything, with patience and money and the strategic application of pressure on whatever point seemed weakest. But he would be fighting the territory now, not just the valley. And he would be fighting a valley that had stopped being fragmented. That evening, Caleb came in from the barn later than usual. The children had eaten and the kitchen had been cleaned, and Evelyn was at the table with the household ledger, a habit by now, the end-of-day accounting, when he came in and sat across from her the way he did sometimes, without announcement, just settling into the chair like a man coming home to something. They sat for a while without talking. Then Caleb said, "I've been thinking about what Thomas told you at the woodpile." She looked up. About my mother saying the hardest thing was getting a Whitmore to admit they need something. He looked at the ledger in front of her without really looking at it. She used to say it with some affection. Thomas doesn't have the context yet to say it that way. "He will," Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. The kitchen lamp put its familiar warmth across the table between them, the same lamp she'd been reading by since her first night in this house, the same table where Noah had fallen asleep against her arm, and Mara had handed her the cinnamon tin, and Eli had asked his first careful question about underground water. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. She waited. "I stopped thinking of you as the housekeeper some time ago," he said. He said it with the careful evenness of someone who has rehearsed the sentence but not how the other person will respond to it. "I don't know exactly when, somewhere between the ledger and the meeting and the barn." A pause. "Probably before the barn." Evelyn put down her pen. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. I know where things stand. I just think you should know that the way I think about what happens on this ranch, to this family." He stopped. Then, "You're part of it. In my head, you're already part of it, and that seemed like something you should know." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him across the table. This man who had put the children needs someone reliable at the bottom of a list instead of the top, who had taken 3 weeks to say something that wasn't practical, who nodded once where other people used whole sentences, whose daughter had almost laughed in his kitchen doorway, and whose son had said 2 words after 8 months of silence, and whose 5-year-old had shown a wooden horse to a stranger at the door. "I know," she said. "I think I've known for a while." He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb," she said. "I told Mara. I meant it." He held her gaze for a moment. Something settled in his face. The particular settling of a man who has been braced for a long time and is learning, incrementally, how to put that down. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat that way while the fire in the stove made its sounds, and the house held its sleeping children around them, and the Montana night pressed its cold immensity against the windows, and the envelope's response sat on the cabinet shelf, like the beginning of an ending that was still a long way from over, but had, unmistakably, begun. The territorial investigator arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the letter. His name was Aldous Fenn, and he was not what Evelyn had pictured. She had pictured someone official-looking, pressed, the kind of man who carries his authority in his clothes. Fenn was 50, lean in the way of someone who has spent decades on horseback, with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of a man who has learned that patience extracts more information than urgency. He arrived alone, tied his horse at the gate himself, and knocked at the front door instead of riding up to whoever was working in the yard, which told Evelyn something about how he operated before he'd said a word. She brought him into the kitchen and gave him coffee, and he sat at the table and looked at the consolidated report with the careful attention of someone reading it for the second time, not the first, which meant he had already read a copy in Helena and was now comparing it against the physical documents. Caleb sat across from him. Evelyn sat to the side, at the corner of the table where she had been sitting when she wrote most of it. Fenn looked up from the report and looked at Evelyn. "You compiled this?" "Yes." "Your husband was a surveyor?" "For 12 years. I kept his accounts for 6 of them." Fenn nodded slowly. "The territorial registry cross-reference, that was your idea." "It was." He turned a page. "The consolidated incident log, the Pruitt fence damage, the Henderson cattle, the Garrett sluice gate. You gathered these from individual families." "With their cooperation, yes." "And the arson?" He looked at the barn documentation, Thomas's careful diagram of the burn pattern, the ranch hand's statements. 2 separate ignition points. The men who came out first both confirmed it independently. They didn't speak to each other before they each told us what they'd seen. Fenn set the report down and looked at both of them. "I want to be clear about where this investigation stands. The registry check is conclusive. There are no corresponding entries for any of the notices issued in this valley. That means the notices were generated fraudulently using county office resources without territorial authorization." He paused. "That alone is a serious criminal matter. The arson, if it can be connected to the same operation, and I believe it can be, elevates this considerably." Caleb said, "Galt." "We're aware of Galt," Fenn said. "He has a history with the territorial office. Smaller matters, previously, nothing that stuck." He looked at the statement from Seaver's ranch hand about the horse at the Mercer Line cabin. "This is useful. The cabin is outside the Blackwell property, which means Galt's activities there are harder for Blackwell to claim ignorance of. A man conducting business on his employer's behalf uses his employer's facilities. A man hiding in an abandoned cabin is doing something his employer either doesn't know about or wants distance from." "Either way, Blackwell loses," Evelyn said. "Either way, one of them gives up the other," Fenn said. "In my experience, that's how these things end, not in a courtroom argument about principle. In a room somewhere, one man deciding that protecting himself matters more than protecting the other." He closed the report. "I need to interview each of the affected families separately. I'll be in the valley for approximately a week. I'd ask that none of you discuss the specifics of what's been gathered with anyone outside the families directly involved. Blackwell will hear that an investigator is here within a day or 2. That's unavoidable in a valley this small, and his response to that will tell us something useful too." Caleb said, "And in the meantime, the assessment deadline. The assessment notices are fraudulent and unenforceable. I'm prepared to issue a written statement to that effect today, which you can present to the county office if any action is attempted." Fenn reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He put it on the table. "No one in this valley owes Victor Blackwell a single dollar on the basis of those notices." The room was quiet for a moment. Caleb looked at the document. He didn't pick it up immediately. He sat with it in front of him the way you sit with something you've been working toward for long enough that its arrival takes a moment to absorb. "Thank you," he said. Fenn stood up and picked up his hat. "Thank the woman who read your water rights registry," he said, and went to interview the next family. Blackwell's response came faster than Fenn had anticipated, which Fenn said later suggested that Blackwell had been more invested in this valley than his public posture indicated, and was more rattled by the investigation than a confident man would be. On the Thursday of Fenn's first week in the valley, Blackwell's solicitor arrived from the county seat with a counterfiling claiming that the consolidated report contained defamatory statements and demanding its suppression. He was a small, precise man in a good coat who arrived at the county clerk's office and found that the county clerk, confronted 2 days earlier by Fenn in a private interview, had developed a sudden and comprehensive willingness to cooperate with the territorial investigation. The suppression filing went nowhere. On Friday, Blackwell appeared in person. Evelyn heard about it from Margaret Henderson, who had been at the general store when Blackwell's wagon came through town. He had not gone to the county office. He had gone to the general store, which was where men in the valley went when they wanted to be seen saying something, and he had said, in front of 6 people, including Silas Pruitt's daughter-in-law, that the investigation was a political maneuver driven by a disgruntled housekeeper who had inserted herself into Valley business she didn't understand, and that any sensible person in the Valley knew better than to let a stranger from Helena dictate their interests. Clara Pruitt, according to Margaret, had looked at him and said, "The stranger from Helena found the fraud in the registry. What did you find?" Blackwell had left shortly after. Margaret told this story to Evelyn with the slight brightness of someone who has thoroughly enjoyed an event they witnessed, and Evelyn received it without expression and said, "He's trying to make this about me instead of about the registry." "He's not wrong that some people will listen to that," Margaret said. "Some will," Evelyn agreed, "but the registry statement is signed by a territorial clerk and Fenn's investigation is already open. What people think about me doesn't change what the records say." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "You don't care much what people think of you." "I care," Evelyn said. "I just can't afford to let it change what I do." The second week of November brought the first real snow of the season, and 2 days into it, the news that Galt had been located. Fenn sent word to Caleb directly. Galt had been found at the Mercer Line cabin, which was where Seaver's hand had placed him, and had been brought in for questioning by the territorial marshal's deputy. In the interview, which Fenn described in careful and understated terms, Galt had initially said nothing useful. Then the deputy had shown him the arson documentation, Thomas's diagram, the ranch hand statements, and a piece of physical evidence Fenn did not specify in his letter, but described as conclusive. And Galt's posture in the interview had changed. He gave a statement. The statement implicated Blackwell in the fraudulent assessment scheme from the beginning, named 2 county officials who had been paid to file and process the notices, and confirmed that the barn fire had been Galt's own action, taken after Caleb's conversation with him had made clear that the ranch was not going to capitulate, and that Galt had made this decision without explicit instruction from Blackwell, though he had informed Blackwell of it afterward. That last detail was the one that mattered legally. Blackwell knew, Caleb said, reading Fenn's letter at the kitchen table while the snow came down outside. After the fact, but he knew. He didn't report it. He didn't stop anything. "That's not the same as ordering it," Evelyn said. "But it's not ignorance either." Fenn says the prosecutor considers it sufficient for conspiracy charges. Evelyn read the letter over his shoulder. The language was measured, procedural, the kind of writing that carries enormous weight in deliberately unexcited terms. She had learned to read it from her husband's professional documents, where the same understatement governed, and she knew what the careful sentences added up to. It added up to Blackwell being finished in this valley. Not immediately. These things moved through channels that took months, sometimes longer. There would be hearings and filings, and the particular slow grind of territorial law working its way through to conclusions. The 2 county officials named in Galt's statement had already retained their own representation, which meant they would likely provide further evidence in exchange for reduced accountability. Blackwell's solicitor would argue everything that could be argued, but the registry statement was signed. The investigator's report was filed. Galt's statement was on record with a territorial seal. The consolidated evidence from 5 Valley families was archived in the territorial prosecutor's office in Helena. You cannot unfile a document. That was the thing Evelyn had understood from the beginning, from the years of keeping her husband's records through creditors and landlords, and the slow institutional machinery of a system that favors whoever has the paperwork. Once the record exists and is properly held, it persists regardless of what anyone wants it to do. Blackwell had built his scheme on documents that could be manufactured. He had not anticipated being opposed by someone who understood that real documents, properly placed, were impossible to manufacture around. She thought about Thomas Carter, her husband, who had taught her this not through instruction but through the meticulous care he brought to his survey records, even when he was too ill to hold a pen steadily. She thought about the way he had told her once, early in the bad winters, that land doesn't care who thinks they own it. The record says what the record says. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the snow on the yard and thought, "I've been carrying you through this whole thing, Thomas. I hope you don't mind." The new barn was finished the second week of December. It was not the barn that had burned. That barn had been built by Caleb's father and had carried 30 years of history in its timber, and that was gone and wasn't coming back. And pretending it was the same would have been a particular kind of lie that nobody in the family was interested in telling themselves. The new barn was smaller, more efficient, built with lumber from the Pruitt supply and the labor of 8 men from 4 families across 2 Saturdays, and it smelled of cut wood and fresh hay and cold air, and it stood on the same ground and served the same purpose and was entirely its own thing. Noah was the first of the children to go inside it. He walked through the new doors on the day they were hung, carrying Ranger under his arm, and he walked the length of the barn in the particular careful way he moved through new spaces, assessing. Then he went to the far end and sat down in the corner of the last stall on the west side and looked up at the roof. Evelyn, who had followed him in, stood at the stall door and watched him. He looked up at the clean new boards above him for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Then he held out Ranger. Not to give, just to show. The way you show something to someone when you want them to understand something you don't have words for yet. He likes it, Noah said. His voice was thin and careful, unused to sentences, feeling its way along them the way you feel your way along a wall in the dark. But it was a sentence, subject, verb, object. 3 words delivered with the gravity of someone who has been saving them up. Evelyn crouched to his level. "I'm glad," she said. She kept her voice steady, which took some effort. "It's a good barn." "We built it," Noah said. "We did," she said. "All of us." He looked at Ranger for a moment. Then he looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention she had come to know as his particular way of seeing. The gaze of a child who learned early that watching carefully was the most reliable thing available to him. "Are you staying?" he said. It was the same question Mara had asked 3 weeks ago from across a kitchen table. It was the question the whole family had been asking in different forms and different registers since the day she'd arrived with 1 suitcase and $11. She understood now that it was not really a question about her plans. It was a question about whether the world was the kind of place where people stayed. She had not been able to answer that for most of her adult life. She had watched Thomas stay as long as he could. She had stayed in rooms she couldn't afford, and in difficult circumstances, and in the particular endurance that grief requires. She had not known, when she answered the advertisement in the Helena paper, whether she was the kind of person who could stay somewhere that required everything. She knew now. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." Noah looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn door, Ranger under his arm, and at the door he stopped and turned back. "Ranger knows," he said. He went out into the snow. Evelyn stayed in the empty stall for a moment, crouched in the corner of the new barn in the cold December air, and did not cry because she was a practical woman and there was supper to start, but it was a near thing. The hearing that formally concluded the territorial investigation took place in February, 4 months after Fenn's arrival in the valley. Caleb went. Evelyn did not. Someone had to be at the ranch, and the children had school, and she had learned by now that her presence in official proceedings had a way of becoming the story instead of the evidence, and the evidence was what mattered. He came back on a Thursday evening with snow on his coat and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment in the way that contained something rather than the way that had nothing in it. "Blackwell's land acquisitions have been frozen pending the outcome of the full trial," he said. "The 2 county officials resigned. The assessment notices have been formally voided. The territorial prosecutor filed conspiracy and fraud charges." He paused. "Galt's out on the arson. He gave enough to the prosecutor that they reduced it." Evelyn had expected that last part. "And Blackwell. He's been released pending trial. His solicitor argues the arson was Galt's alone and Blackwell had no knowledge before the fact." Caleb looked at the table. "Fenn thinks they'll get him on the fraud and the conspiracy even without the arson. He said the registry evidence alone is enough for conviction. The rest just determines how long." "How long does Fenn think?" He said, and I am quoting because it was the most Fenn has ever said at once, "Men like Blackwell do not recover from having their paperwork examined. The law is slower than he is. It is also longer." Caleb looked at her. "He asked me to tell you that." "He didn't need to." "I think he wanted to." Caleb stood up and took off his coat. "Henderson was there. And Pruitt. Severs came too, which surprised me." "It shouldn't," Evelyn said. "He shook my hand afterward," Caleb said. "First time in 6 years." She looked at him. He was at the coat rack, hanging up his coat with the same care he brought to everything. and his back was to her, but she could see in the set of his shoulders that something had released in him, some long-held weight that had been so familiar he'd stopped noticing it was there. "The fence line," she said. He turned. "We settled it. Last month." He said it simply, without drama, the way you say a thing that happened that you should have done sooner and know it and have decided to own that without dwelling on it. "I was wrong about where it was. Took me a while to admit it." "Thomas will be impressed," Evelyn said. Caleb almost smiled. It was not a full smile. A Whitmore smile never quite went all the way, she had come to understand, but it was the shape of one, the edges of it. "He already knows," Caleb said. "He was the one who told me I was wrong." Spring came the way Montana spring comes, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments, warm days conceding back to cold, and then winning again day by day until the cold had no ground left to stand on. The new barn settled into the yard as though it had always been there. The kitchen garden, which Evelyn had coaxed through the fall and planned through the winter, broke ground in April with a clarity that felt almost aggressive, the way things grow when they've been properly tended after a period of neglect. The family changed in the ways that families change, incrementally, without announcement, through the accumulation of ordinary days. Mara turned 18 in March. She had spent the winter learning what Evelyn knew about household management, not because Evelyn insisted, but because Mara asked, which was the difference between instruction and education. She had stopped carrying the weight of everyone else's survival. She had started, tentatively, and with the occasional visible terror of someone trying something after years of not allowing herself to want things, talking about what she might want for her own life, separate from the ranch, separate from the role she'd been holding since February of the previous year. There was a school in Helena that trained women for clerical positions, and she had written them a letter, and the letter had been answered, and she had read the answer 3 times before telling anyone about it. She told Evelyn first. Then she told her father. Caleb received it the way he received all difficult things, quietly, with a single nod, and then went outside for 20 minutes, and when he came back he said, "When does it start?" And when Mara told him September, he nodded again and said, "Then we've got until September to make sure you know everything you need to know," and went back to supper. Mara had looked at Evelyn across the table with an expression that communicated, without words, that she understood what her father's nod had cost him, and that she was grateful, and that she was also going to Helena in September regardless. Thomas grew 2 inches over the winter and stopped being a boy who observed from a distance and started being a young man who waded into things, which was not uniformly easier for everyone around him, but was considerably better for him. He and Caleb began working the ranch together in a different way, less like employer and hired hand and more like 2 people who had agreed to build the same thing, which was what they were. Eli got his book back. Evelyn had quietly ordered a second one from Helena on Western geological formations and left it on the table without comment, and it had produced a conversation about aquifer depth that had lasted 3 evenings and required Caleb to admit he didn't know what an aquifer was, which he did with the specific grudging respect of a man who has found the limits of his own knowledge and prefers to understand the territory. The twins were the twins. They would always be the twins, in the specific way that twins in a family are their own contained weather system, and Evelyn had stopped trying to regulate them and started simply making sure they were fed and warm and accounted for at the end of each day, which was the achievable standard and the right one. And Noah. Noah talked. Not constantly, not like the other children. He was not going to be a child who filled silences, and maybe never would be, and that was its own kind of person, and not a diminished one. But he talked. He asked questions with the careful precision of someone who had spent a year listening, and had developed the habit of meaning every word he used. He told Evelyn things, about Ranger, about what he saw in the pasture, about a bird he'd seen on the fence that he wanted to identify, which led to another book, which led to a running project of bird documentation that he and Eli were conducting in a shared notebook with the gravity of professional naturalists. On a warm evening in May, he climbed up onto the bench beside Evelyn at the kitchen table while she was working in the ledger and put Ranger on the table in front of her. "You can hold him," he said. She looked down at the wooden horse, the repaired ear, the worn paint, the wire bent with care. She looked at Noah. "Are you sure?" she said. He looked at her with the particular steadiness that was entirely his own. "Ranger knows you belong here," he said. She picked up the horse carefully and held it in both hands. It was light, worn smooth in the places where a child's hands had held it for years, and it was the most significant object she had been given since her wedding ring, and she understood it in exactly that proportion. "Thank you," she said. He leaned against her arm, the same way he had on her first night in the kitchen, only this time he wasn't falling asleep and wasn't in distress. He was just there, beside her, in the warm kitchen in the spring evening, because he wanted to be. On a Saturday in June, Caleb asked her to walk with him out to the South Ridge after supper. This was not unusual. They walked sometimes in the evenings, the two of them, when the children were occupied and the day had finished its demands. It had become, over the months, its own kind of conversation, the kind that happens when you don't have to look directly at each other and can say things that are harder to say face to face. The South Ridge looked out over the whole valley. The Whitmore land in the foreground, the Henderson property to the east, the line of the creek that ran through Pruitt's land visible as a silver thread in the long June light. The Blackwell holdings to the north were quiet. They had been quiet since February. There was some talk in the valley about what would happen to the land after the trial concluded, which had not happened yet and would not happen soon, but the talk had the quality of people planning for a future they now believed would exist. Caleb stood on the ridge with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the valley for a while without saying anything. Evelyn stood beside him and let him look. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, "when you first told me why you answered the advertisement." She thought back to that kitchen conversation, the second morning. "I needed somewhere I could actually be useful, rather than somewhere I could simply be employed." "I remember," she said. "I think you got that," he said, "in case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," she said, "but thank you." He was quiet for a moment. The valley spread out below them in the evening light, and the wind came up the ridge with the smell of the creek and the new grass and something that was simply the smell of Montana in June, which was its own specific and unrepeatable thing. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said, "and I want you to know that however you answer, nothing changes. The room is yours. The position is yours. I'm not asking with any conditions attached." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the valley, which was how he said hard things, she had learned. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "not as the housekeeper, as more than that. I want to ask you to be part of this, formally." He paused. "I'm not good at this kind of asking, I know that. I'm better with cattle counts and fence line disputes, and that's a poor qualification for what I'm trying to say." "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "If you want to. If this place is where you want to be." The valley was very quiet. The light was doing what June light does in the late evening, going golden and long across the grass, putting everything in its best version of itself. She thought about the morning she had arrived, the sagging porch, the faded paint, the boy with the wooden horse, the ledger with its widening gaps, the children who had learned to wait for people to leave, the man who had written the children need someone reliable at the bottom of a list because he didn't know how to put the most important thing first. She thought about Noah's 2 words, "Ranger safe," the first sentence back from wherever he had gone. She thought about Thomas, her first Thomas, who had mapped land he would never stand on and taught her that the record matters, that what you put in writing is what persists, that the careful work you do in ordinary time is the thing that holds when everything else tries to fall. She thought about what she had come here with. 1 suitcase, $11, the stubborn refusal to look at a problem and walk away from it. You don't plan the life that fits you. That had been the surprise of this year, the thing she had not expected when she stepped off a stagecoach onto a rutted road in October. You do the work that's in front of you, with honesty and without flinching, and the life assembles itself around that work if you're paying attention and willing to stay. She had been paying attention. She had stayed. "Yes," she said, "this is where I want to be." He turned to look at her then, just looked at her for a moment in the way that was rare for him. Direct, without the management, without the careful Whitmore composure holding everything at a slight remove. He reached out and took her hand. They stood on the south ridge while the light went and the valley settled into its evening and the stars came out over the Montana mountains. The same excessive, argumentative stars that had been there on her first night, still making their point about scale, still indifferent to any particular human story, and therefore, somehow, the right witness to this one. She was not the same woman who had arrived with one suitcase. She did not think she had become someone else. She thought she had become more fully herself, which is not the same as improvement, not a cleaner or simpler version, but the particular arriving at yourself that only happens when difficulty has asked you who you are and you have answered honestly and kept answering. The greatest things are not inherited. She believed that. She had believed it before, in the abstract, in the way you believe things you have not yet been asked to prove. Now she believed it from evidence, from a kitchen ledger and a valley meeting and a signed territorial document and a wooden horse held out by a 5-year-old with absolute confidence that she belonged to him. Built. One ordinary day at a time. One choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. One problem faced directly instead of walked around. That was the whole of it. That was enough.